Hey friends, it's Laura with Laura's Handmade Haven. Welcome or welcome back. I'm so glad you joined me today. We're going to be kicking off our next quilt along, which is the Delightful Desert Baby Quilt. This pattern is designed by Elizabeth Hartman. You can find the pattern, I'm sure, at many quilt shops. I know you can definitely get it on Amazon, which is where I purchased mine, and several of the other online quilt shops as well. You can also order it from her website, so it should be pretty easy to get. If you're interested in doing this quilt along with me. So today's video, we're going to focus on just getting organized and getting our things together and just doing a little bit of planning and a little bit of cutting. So when we start working with our individual blocks, it's going to be much easier moving forward. Now, I'm doing the small quilt, which means I am just making 9 blocks. Let me move a little closer so you can see that. I'm making 9 blocks, so I'll have the 9 blocks plus the sashing and borders. If you're making the medium, you're going to be doing 4 of those block units. Each block unit has the 9 blocks. So if you're doing the medium quilt, you're going to have 36 blocks. If you're doing the large quilt, you're going to have 81 blocks. So you'll have 9 block units for that large quilt. Now I have put together a little bit of an organization sheet for you guys, and let me just kind of go through that real quick too. Just so you can kind of understand my thought process on this. I like being organized when I start doing projects, and sometimes, you know, if you're in the middle of a block or in the middle of a sew and you have to quit for dinner or company or whatever, it's hard to figure out where you are at if you don't start by being organized with your project supplies. So what I've done is this is a 3-page guide, and I will have a link in the description box down below, but basically it is a quilt project organization sheet specifically for this pattern. So on the first page, you're going to find that you have 2 tables, and this is only if you're going to be curating your own fabric. So when I decided to do this baby quilt, I decided I wanted to do Southwest colors, and I wanted to make sure those plants were shades of greens, and then I needed a couple extra colors in there just to give myself a little wiggle room and a little playroom in case I didn't like the way the fabrics fell in line with the different blocks. So I'm definitely curating my fabric a little differently than what the pattern shows. I did get fat quarters of all of those fabrics. I think I ended up with like 10 fat quarters instead of the 6 that the pattern calls for. Now, if you're doing the 6 fat quarters, you're going to have something that's a little more monochromatic. When you look at this chart right here, you're going to see there are 9 of those block units, and you can see each one is basically a good color pathway, and she gives you all of those color breakdowns inside the pattern, so you'll have that to go with if that's how you want to select your fabrics. Now the baby quilt was also monochromatic, sort of, in the same colorway, and she suggested a fat quarter bundle of a certain color path for that. I didn't choose to do that. I have a pretty diverse fabric colorway, again, in those Southwest colors, except for the plants that I want to do in shades of green. So I definitely have more than the 6 fat quarters, and I have numbered them. As you can see, I went through the pattern and just kind of decided I want this for the moth, I want this for the fawn, things like that, and kind of tried to pick my numbers of fabrics based on what I wanted specifically colored a certain way in the pattern. But again, I'm making this way more complicated than the pattern needs to be. So you could definitely go with one of the colorways she recommends, or go with just like a monochromatic color theme, and that way you would just be able to label your fabrics 1 through 6 and follow the cutting guide exactly in the pattern. You're not going to see me do that, again, because I've customized and sort of curated my own fabric choices for this quilt. All right, so if you decide that you want to curate your own fabric, these 2 tables on the first page will help you do that. It just kind of tells you where the fabrics are used, which block they're used in, and how often they're used. And I do give you the table in 2 different formats because everyone's brain works a little differently. And maybe neither one of these will work for you, but if you want to use them, one of them has the fabrics listed on the left-hand column, and one of them has the blocks listed in the left-hand column. So you can read across and see, oh, okay, well, fabric 1 is only used in the first 3 blocks here, and fabric 2 is used in these 3, and so on in this chart. Now, the second page in the organization sheet is all about getting labels on your bags. So I'm using 10 Ziploc bags. I have 1 for each of the 9 blocks, plus 1 for sashing and borders. Again, if you're completing the medium or the large quilt, then you're going to need a lot more bags, or you're going to figure out a way to clip them together inside of each of these individual 9-block bags. And then down below, I also give you kind of a tracker sheet that you can just mark your blocks off as you complete them. This is really helpful if you're doing one of the larger sizes. If you're doing the small, you're probably going to know if the block is done or not. But if you have 9 of something to make, then you may want to try to just keep those marked off on the tracker sheet as you go along. The other thing you're going to find on this little tracker table here is the highest letter for each one of the blocks. When you look down this list, you can see some of them, like the jade, is only up through letter H, so that's going to tell you have a lot less pieces for that than, let's say, the crane, who's up through letter double M. All of the blocks start at A and go up through the alphabet, so this is kind of gives you a quick guide to see about how many pieces and how complicated that block might be. So maybe you decide that you want to try one of the blocks and not all of the blocks. You can use this to decide which one you want to take on. The last sheet is really just alphabet letters. And I just put this here for you. So if you are going to be quilting along with me and you want a quick, easy way to label all your blocks and you don't have to make your own, then I've already included a table that goes all the way through double Z. And you'll be able to just to print these and cut them apart and pin them or clip them onto your fabrics as you cut them out. Now, all right, so going back to the pattern, there's a ton of information in there, and you will just need to work your way through the pattern. I'm going to give you some basics today on just how I'm going to start cutting and my plan to conquer this 9-block baby quilt. And then we will get started next week with some sewing. So I'm hoping that this portion of the video will help you just kind of understand how I am getting organized and how I'm going to use the different bags that we just discussed and how I'm going to tackle all the different fabrics that we have to work with. So like I said, you will have at least 6 of the fabrics plus a black and white, so that's 8, plus your background, which is 9. So you'll have at least 9 different fabrics that you're working with. So the first thing I'm going to do, and this is the first thing they have you do in the pattern, is start to cut the background. Now you will see in my project tote over here, along with my ruler that's laying across, I have all of my Ziploc bags. So those labels that I showed you on page 2 of the organization sheet, I have used those labels to label all of my Ziplocs. So all of these bags have a name of the block on them. So as I go through and I cut the various strips for different blocks, I will be putting them in the bag. The way that she has you get organized and use this pattern is that you go through and you cut all of your strips, all of your fabrics first, and you divide them into the various blocks. And then those are in the individual bags, and then you'll go back and subcut all of those strips into smaller pieces for each of the blocks. Now I'm going to deviate a little bit from that because I have curated my own fabrics. So I will be cutting my background fabric and I'm going to put them in the bags as she recommends. But then when I get to cutting the fabrics for the individual blocks, I'm going to be flipping through and making sure I cut the right color strips for each one of those. Now all the fabrics that I am using are from the Basic Gray Grunge line. I really like this fabric line just because it has a lot of shading and shadowing and a little bit of grunginess in it. So I'm using basically solid fabrics, but they're not flat. I tend to just not like solids that much, so this is as close to solid as you'll see me using most of the time. Now because I do have my fabric hanging off the table, I just want to make sure that when I make this cut that it won't fall off the table on me. So I just put that little vintage iron there just to give myself a little weight on the fabric to make sure that it doesn't go anywhere. Now I'm not going to be sharing any measurements with you, so please just understand that I will not be sharing, the different cuts that I'm making. Obviously some of them you'll probably be able to figure out, but I'm not going to share any of the numbers with you. All of that is in the pattern, obviously. So you'll want to get yourself a pattern if you want that information. The first thing they have you cut is the borders. So all these 2 will go into my border bag, which is not labeled, but I know this is my border bag. It's border and sashing, so that will go in there. Now since that is border and sashing, I'm going to put that in the bottom of my project box, and it's just going to stay there because it'll be one of the last things I use. I do have some strips that I might be able to use for other things. I'm not going to get rid of them, but I'm just going to put them off to the side for right now. All right, now I'm just going to follow the pattern, and I'm just going to cut the other background strips that it tells me to do for each one of the blocks, and I'll put those in the appropriate bag as I get to them. So just make sure that you have your fabric lined up really good and straight, just because you don't want anything funky to happen to you as you're cutting. And then you're just going to follow the cutting directions on page 2 of the cutting guide and start cutting the different strips for the different blocks. And then as I cut these, I'm going to put them in the appropriate bag. And I'm going to just lay the bags so kind of face down, because that way they'll go back into the pile in the correct order when I'm done cutting the background. This is definitely different than the way you approach a Lori Holt quilt for cutting. For her quilts, you usually start with all the fabrics, and she gives you a long cutting guide, and you start cutting everything by fabric. This one, you kind of cut it by block a little bit. So just a little bit of a different method. I think the last time that I did one of her patterns, I did go through and I just cut out each block individually, which was fine. But I think just being able to know that that's my background fabric for this block is going to be really nice. It's going to be interesting, and I haven't, you know, I do these as I'm making the quilt, right? So like I have not made this quilt before, and it will be interesting to me to see how much fabric is wasted, I guess, with this method. I don't know if we're going to have a lot of fabric left over, and if so, that's going to be kind of a bummer. I think that, you know, maybe there was a way that I could have used less fabric and been more efficient with the cutting, but I'm just going to trust the process at this point. That crane block, whew, when I saw the double M on the pattern for the crane block, I was like, oh my, that's going to be a whole bunch of pieces. I think sometimes, even if you don't get all the information or whatever, if you're following along with the pattern, I think sometimes just to see somebody else do this and to go through it, it definitely gives you some good information. So I hope that this will help you just kind of think about how you want to get organized with this quilt, or any of her quilts really, because she has a lot of great patterns out there. So just, you know, pick one that you like and go with it. All right, so that is all the background fabric strips that I need to cut. And you may be wondering why I have so much background fabric, and well, that's because I had decided that I was going to not only do the background, but I'm also going to do the binding and the backing of my quilt all out of this really pretty tan. So I am going to go ahead and cut my binding as well, just because I have the fabric out and it's unfolded. So I'm going to go ahead and cut my binding strips. And I know that the small quilt is basically 36-inch square. So I know I'm going to need 4 2.5-inch strips for binding. So I'm just going to go ahead and cut those. And these strips I'll also put in with the border and sashing, just because that way they'll be ready for me when I get to that point in the project. Now feel free to label these different things if you need to. I'm gonna just take a chance and be okay with it. I need to get this quilt done rather quickly because the baby is on the way. And the extra fabric that I have is after I'm cutting is I will just put in the bottom of the project tote, and then the things that are in the bags are for the blocks themselves. All right, so the pattern tells you just to keep the black and the white fabric kind of off to the side if you're doing the small quilt. If you're doing the medium or the large, there are some cutting instructions for you. But basically for the small quilt, we're just going to kind of keep these to the side. And when we go to cut out the individual block, when we subcut all these things down, you'll have the measurements for what you need to cut out of black and white for each block. So we're going to start working on each individual fabric, and now remember mine is going to be different than what yours would be. If you're using one of the colorways that she's outlined in the book, then it's going to be probably a lot easier for you. I have to check my blocks with each color and decide if that's what I want to use for that. I do have some choices, so we will just kind of go with it. Okay, so before we start cutting our individual fabrics for our blocks, I just want to tell you that this is when you know that I revise things as we go through. So as I'm doing a project, before I give it to you, I definitely make sure that I'm cutting it out and going through the process, and then I make revisions as needed. So one of the revisions that I just decided that I needed to do was I also included a chart over here that is for the numbering of your fabrics in the individual bags. Because I am curating my own fabric collection, my one may not be the same in the aloe block as the ringtail block. So I wanted to make sure I had a way that I could cut out these numbers and then clip those to the different fabric strips that I put in the bags. So this is an update to the guide, and it will be in the link below. These are not my fabric scissors. These are my paper scissors. And I'm just going to kind of roughly cut this out. And you're going to do the same thing for these letters when we reach that point. I'll put that to the side because we'll use that another time. So I'm just going to cut off this first column because I'm going to be cutting all of fabric 1 first. And I will be updating this table so you only have the amount of numbers that you need based on that first table that tells you how many blocks use each fabric. So you won't have to cut out all the numbers, you'll just need to cut out the ones that you need. So fabric 1 is used for the moth, ringtail, and crane. So I'm going to be looking in the pattern in the book and the pattern and deciding which colors I want to use for those. But if you're just using one of the curated colors, then just go with what she tells you to do with fabric 1. All right, so here's my fat quarter for fabric 1. Here are my little numbers, and I'm just going to start cutting based on what they tell me to do in the pattern. The first thing I need to do is just kind of straighten up this edge. And I'm going to use the selvage to do that. A very, very, very nice, kind woman at Ben Franklin cut all these fabric quarters for me. And no, you did not mishear me. I did say Ben Franklin because there are 2 Ben Franklins in Missouri. They're in Monroe City and Macon. So if you're in either one of those areas, you can go and visit a Ben Franklin. Now they are not like the original Ben Franklin chain that was around way back when, but they kind of mimic them a little bit in some ways. They definitely have the same type of products and such. So it's kind of fun to go in there and just look. And they have a really nice fabric department. And that's where I got all of my basic gray. My husband and I just happened to be up in that area. We did a little antiquing that day. So it was fun. All right, so you do have a little bit left over of fabric 1. Not a ton, but a little bit. And then these will go into the various bags for the different blocks. Just gotta look up which blocks get these. And I did leave them in the order of cutting, so I would know, so I can follow along in the pattern basically. So I'm just going to clip that on there. And then when I go to pull out the bag of the fabric for that block, it will be clipped and I know, oh, that's fabric 1 and I need to cut whatever. All right, let's see, fabric 1. All right, so now I'm going to pull out fabric 2. Again, since I've curated my own fabrics, I want to make sure that everything looks right for fabric 2. My fabric 2 is this pretty green color, and I did that because I wanted to make sure the jade was that color. Okay, so this one I'm going to deviate just a little bit because I am going to cut this for the fawn, and the other 2 will be for the crane and jade. This is like the main color for the fawn, and I don't really want a green fawn. Now this fabric, I'm going to set it off to the side just in case I decide I need to use it someplace else. The green I'm fairly certain I won't, but we'll set it off to the side too. All right, so it looks like I'm going to be fine with using the green for everything except the ringtail. So I'm going to go ahead and cut that one first and get it put away. Now this one I left way longer than it needs to be, but I'm just going to leave it. So this one I'm gonna switch up a little bit because, yeah. So we're gonna go back to this. I don't want a green coyote and I don't want a green bunny. So let's see here. All right, so I also had to look at the coyote pattern, which is another tip for you. It called for a specific size of fabric in the cutting, and I did not have that. So I went to look at the block itself and confirm that I don't necessarily need as big of a piece as what it's calling for in the cutting guide. I can just cut it differently and it will be okay. So I was able to use the color that I wanted just because I referenced the individual block pattern and realized that I don't necessarily need as big of a piece as what they were thinking I did. Which that tells me that we probably will have some waste with cutting it out like this in advance. But it'll probably be all right. It'll be interesting to see how much waste we have with each of the blocks. Hopefully not too much. So if I would have this to do over, one thing that I would change is that I would have put my blocks in alphabetical order instead of the order that they give you in the cutting guide, just because it's taking me I feel like it's taking me longer to find them because I have to go in the block order rather than alphabetical order. And if I was able to go in alphabetical order, I would be able to find crane and aloe a lot faster than when they're in the middle or to back of the stack. Just a little hint for you if you're going to be stacking your bags. I would go alpha order. All right, fabric 5. All right, so this is going to be my fabric 5 except for the moth, which that'll be that one. And like I said, just because I curated my own fabric color pathway for this quilt, and I'm being a little picky with what is what. It's just going to take me a little longer when deciding which fabrics should go where, but you know, it'll be all right. I'll be happy with the end result, so that's all that really matters. We are almost there on our cutting. Well, at least for our blocks, I guess. We have lots more cutting to go, but this is going to give us a really good start when we start breaking into individual blocks. So I definitely would, so we'll see as we go along to decide whether or not we feel like this was a good path, or if it was easy, if it would have been easier just to leave all the fabrics in a pile and cut them out as you go rather than divide them up in the bags. Like I said, this is the first one that I've done like this, so I'm just going to try to trust the process and go with it. That's hard for me to do, I'm just going to be honest. Okay, so I have all my fabric cut. It's all divided up in between the different bags for the different blocks. So I am ready to start working on each individual block with our next video. So our first block that we'll be doing next week is the ringtail block, because that's the first block in the pattern that it tells you to make. So next week we'll pull out our bag for the ringtail block, plus that black and white fabric that we need to do the little accents in the block, and then we'll get it sewn up and we'll have our first of 9 blocks done for our Elizabeth Hartman Delightful Desert baby quilt. So hey, this is going to be super fun. I hope that you picked up some tips and tricks or saw some of my mistakes today so you can not make the same mistakes I did. If you're planning on curating your fabric, make sure you download that organization sheet. I think it will really help you out. That's linked in the description box down below. And yeah, I really hope that some of you guys are going to start sewing along with me on this project. I'm excited to get it started. I'm excited to get it finished. I'm excited to get it quilted and delivered. So yeah, lots of things to do. Until next time, find joy in all you do. Carve out some time for crafting and creating. And remember, it's always better when you make stuff up.